Good evening, and welcome to High Wycombe. For the record, today's date is 13 February 1943, and the time is 1838 hours Zulu. Now, for those of you who have not been to High Wycombe before, I'll give you a 15-second snapshot of this particular installation and facility. Wycombe Abbey School was established here in this building in 1896 and has been in continuous operation and is in operation today, however, in a different location. Because in January of last year, 1942, the Royal Air Force requisitioned the facility, giving the school 3 weeks to move, which they successfully did, and they continue to be in operation. The Royal Air Force took the time to refurbish and make suitable for military operations. They named it Camp Lynn at Dawes Hill, and in late May turned it over to the Army Air Force, and in early June, the United States Army 8th Air Force occupied the facility, and that is the bomber command that you're in today. Now, everyone here has been properly vetted on a need-to-know basis. And I will remind you that the information you receive today will be confidential and highly confidential in nature. I would also remind you that under no circumstances shall anyone in this group disclose the location, purpose, or personnel of this facility. Now with that, let me give you a quick snapshot of the global military situation. As you can see, the Axis powers do have some considerable real estate around the world, and I'll be discussing each of these theaters briefly. The general situation in a phrase is, it's better than it was a year ago. Let's look first at the Pacific Theater. The Pacific Theater, as you can see, the Japanese Empire has expanded significantly since 1933, and they have established a significant perimeter of islands which they are using for defense and or expansion. I'll be mentioning New Guinea down here, which is a very significant location of several battles which have taken place. In a word, in the Pacific, things are improving. In April of last year, as you know, now General, then Colonel Doolittle, with 16 B-25s, took off the aircraft carrier Hornet and attacked the Japanese mainland. In May of 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea was very significant because it blocked a Japanese invasion of the southeastern portion, and specifically Port Moresby in New Guinea. And the reason that's significant is Port Moresby is 94 miles from Australia. It would have given them a launching point, airfields for raids, as well as a potential invasion of Australia. We lost one carrier, the Lexington. We also badly damaged another Japanese carrier, which had to be towed away from the field of battle. And that became significant a month later because at the Battle of Midway, that fifth carrier wasn't there. The Battle of Midway was a resounding victory for the United States. The Kaga, the Akagi, the Hiryu, and the Soryu all were sunk. 4 of Japan's best carriers. 3,000 Japanese lives were lost. Moreover, 300 of their best pilots and planes were gone forever, and they could ill afford to lose them. Our total losses at Midway were 307. Major New Guinea victories. While we turned away the Japanese at Port Moresby, we also, since then, have attacked and captured the only 2 other ports which happen to be in northern New Guinea. Buna we captured in early January, and Snananda we captured in late January. So now the Japanese have no way to withdraw the remaining forces of their garrison, and we're basically in a mop-up operation. I'm very pleased to say 4 days ago, 9 February, the last Japanese, what few there were, the last Japanese forces were withdrawn from Guadalcanal. It's ours. China, Burma, India has been very challenging. As you see, China, Burma, Siam, French Indochina, etc., all under Japanese domination, or parts of China, I should say. In the first half of 42, Japan completed their conquest of Burma, and we're in a position right now where allies are helping allies. Britain and China has been at war with Japan since 1937. In March of last year, Rangoon fell, and within a matter of days, the Burma Road was closed. That was the way we took supplies to our China allies. So, literally weeks later, we began flying the hump with primarily C-46 aircraft, which is considerably larger, carries 3 times as much as a C-47, although on good days, with good weather, C-47s would also fly. Britain and India, as a result of a major event which took place ending 3 weeks ago, began providing additional assistance, and Gurkha, British, and Indian troops, a matter of a few weeks ago, began initial incursions against Japanese forces in Burma. The North Africa theater. Almost all of North Africa, including Egypt down here, much of that has been occupied and controlled by the Axis powers. The British and Italians had been fighting for about 2 years, and the British had been gaining the upper hand. In February of 41, to shore up their allies, the Germans and Rommel arrived, and their battle went back and forth over the next year or so. However, 4 months ago, in October, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, British forces prevailed, decisively defeated Rommel and the Afrika Korps, and the Desert Rats prevailed. The Americans arrived in November of 42 in the far west of Africa, North Africa, and so now joining the British allies, coming from the west and from the east, Rommel is getting squeezed. Triumph Theater is likely. The Atlantic Theater. The tide is turning. Escorts and technology have improved and have helped us. One item that I will disclose to you, a new technology which is called, and I hope I pronounce it correctly, ASDIC, A-S-D-I-C, which enables our destroyers to detect submarines underwater. Now, there are some classified details I'm not at liberty to disclose to you about its limitations. However, it is helping us win the Battle of the Atlantic. Operation Drumbeat, the half a dozen or so German Type 9 U-boats, very long range and large U-boats, which were terrorizing the east coast of the United States. They've been withdrawn, again, because of successful naval operations. B-24s from the Royal Air Force as well as the Navy have been able to close what is called the Black Pit of the Atlantic, which was an area where air cover did not previously exist. And now these B-24s are able to detect submarines on the surface at night, which is when they come up to replenish their batteries. They're getting no rest. Now, we actually cracked the original Enigma code back in February of last year, a year ago. It was a 2-rotor system. We captured a submarine, the British captured a submarine, and were able to spirit off an Enigma machine prior to the submarine sinking when it was being scuttled. That Enigma machine gave us ciphers for about 2 months, based upon the expected duration of the sortie of the submarine. Interestingly, the Germans improved Enigma in the summer of last year and went to a 4-rotor system from a 2-rotor system. So we had to kind of start over. So the British got another submarine, and they got another machine, and we've completely cracked the Enigma Triton code, and so we're reading their mail. The European theater looks pretty grim. There are 5, Ireland, Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal, neutral countries, but everything else is under Axis domination. So on the surface of it, grim. But let's take an actual look. As the Prime Minister says, we have seen the end of the beginning. The 8th Air Force began to arrive in May of last year, and in August, we had the first B-17 raid against Axis targets. And in December, from North Africa, B-24s attacked Italy. In January, the first U.S. bomber attack took place against Germany. That was on 27 January, and again on 4 February, about 9 days ago. And the significance of this event is very great. On 31 January, the entire German 6th Army ceased to exist. For a number of reasons, they did not withdraw their troops strategically, so they could fight again another day. 200,000 members of the Wehrmacht are killed or captured by our Russian allies. All during this time, our RAF allies have been relentlessly bombing, often with great losses, the German homeland. Something significant happening last month. And it happened in Casablanca. The code name was Symbol. Symbol was a conference between the Prime Minister of England, Churchill, and President Roosevelt. It occurred from the 14th to the 24th of January of this year. It ended 3 weeks ago today. It took place at the Antha Hotel, and a few days ago there was official release of the information that this conference took place. And this is the official routing of the Prime Minister and the President to Casablanca. It doesn't say, and it wasn't said, whether or not it was by ship or by plane or by carrier pigeon or outrigger canoe. It doesn't say how they got there. And there's a reason for that. The Prime Minister flew. He's been flying for quite a while, by the way. He must be a frequent flyer. He was very poorly, may I say, disguised as an RAF officer and boarded a Lancaster bomber for an unheated, uncomfortable flight where he could not smoke his cigar to Casablanca. Now, that's the official route of FDR. Is that how he got there? I don't think so. This is classified. This is how he got there. He went from Washington to Miami in a train, aboard the Dixie Clipper, from Miami to Trinidad, from there refueling, Trinidad to Belém, Brazil, refueling, Belém to British Gambia, and from British Gambia he changed to a United States Army Air Force aircraft, a C-54, a modified C-54, for the flight to Casablanca. It became quickly known as the Sacred Cow. Now, this is a picture of Roosevelt aboard the train on the way to Miami with Mrs. Roosevelt, and it's a picture of the lounge car. This is a picture of the Dixie Clipper. Yes, it is a Pan Am aircraft. It had been requisitioned by the government of the United States for military purposes. This is a picture of the Sacred Cow. Now, that's an actual photograph of FDR aboard the Sacred Cow on the way to, several of these photographs, by the way, were expressed to us by General Arnold in Washington for me to share with you today, on the way to Casablanca. The conference had several things on the agenda. Determine military strategy, the resource allocation to various theaters of operation, the bombing plan in Europe, and diplomatic policy to end the war. The highest levels of military staff were present. So the decisions reached. The Americans wanted to attack in Western Europe right away. They wanted to land in France. Churchill said, not so fast. Maybe we're not ready for that. Let's go on through what he referred to as the soft underbelly of Europe. So let's go through Sicily, Italy first. Western Europe later. More British help we're going to get in the Pacific Theater of Operations as well as CBI. The European theater bombing campaign was defined, and to end the war, we were going to require unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. Now about the bombing. The British advocated night raids, and their arguments were pretty telling. They had tried daylight raids. They didn't bomb terribly accurately, and they suffered very heavy losses. What they referred to as the bombing was uneconomical. That's their terminology, as well as the Germans, by the way. They resorted to night area raids and pointed to the Luftwaffe's exactly the same experience. Now, the British were saying we can undermine their morale. We're going to kill people, we're going to wound people, they're going to have to be evacuated, their homes will be destroyed, they won't have utilities or any power, water, etc., and will destroy their will to resist. The Americans didn't really agree with that, but Churchill was adamant about, we are going to bomb at night, we're going to stop this daylight foolishness, you guys just can't do it. And he said very acidly to Roosevelt, I note that the Americans have not yet succeeded in dropping a single bomb on Germany. And as of today, 13 February 1943, it is no longer true. It was true when he said it. Now, what Churchill proposed, and the argument, by the way, at the staff level, was going very much against the Americans. The Army Air Force stopped the daylight raids and joined the RAF. Basically, we become an adjunct to, subservient to the RAF, and bomb at night. And by the way, stop building those B-17s, B-24s, and the like, and start to build Lancasters. No, that's a real plane. Okay? Roosevelt was on the verge of agreeing. And the United States, Hap Arnold, Toohey Spatz, our generals were very much disturbed by this and dismayed. What they needed was a Hail Mary, or more correctly, a Hail Ira. Now, General Ira Aker was the head of the United States Army 8th Air Force in England. He was an interesting guy. He was a graduate in journalism from the University of Southern California. He was also a World War I fighter pilot. He had the ability to very eloquently write and speak, whether one-on-one or in a group, very persuasively. He knew his stuff. He would send 6-page memos to Hap Arnold, the overall commander of all Army Air Forces worldwide. Hap Arnold loved them because they were beautifully written, well organized, and told him everything he could possibly want to know. Well, he was summoned to come straight to Casablanca, which he did. Comes to the rescue. And what his argument was, guys, we're going to do precision bombing, not guess bombing. He pointed out that this is interesting. During day bombing, the British margin, circular margin, that is, anything falling within this distance from the aiming point is acceptable. That circular margin was 5 miles in radius. In other words, if it hits within a 10-mile diameter of the target, it's acceptable, and at that rate, by the way, they were hitting 20% of their bombs within 5 miles of the target, or a 10-mile diameter. At night, 1.5% of their bombs were falling within 3 miles at night. In other words, they weren't hitting a lot, but they were starting a lot of fires. There was also the time and cost to retrain. We've got momentum now. Why do we want to stop that? We've got them shaken up a little bit. Let's not stop. This is the best way to hamper their war effort, by going after specifically their war effort, and we can do that. There's a great danger having 2 large air fleets in the sky, and we had to convince Churchill. That was the thing that we really had to do, because the argument was swaying now. We were doing well against the British chiefs of staff. However, Churchill was the guy. Now, Aker and Churchill had a one-to-one meeting. Aker knew that he could not give Churchill a 6-page memo. Churchill was a get-to-the-point guy, and Churchill also loved prose. So when Aker met with Churchill reviewed, and it was a bulletized type of memo, 1 page, with the points that I saw a moment ago. But the key element was the last line of this 1-page memo to Churchill, and this is exactly that last line. If the RAF continues night bombing, and we bomb by day, we shall bomb them round the clock, and the devil shall get no rest. Well, Churchill looked up and smiled, nodded. He was persuaded, and daylight bombing was on. Or put another way, if everybody's thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking. General Patton. The Casablanca Conference directive was, the major objective is to destroy the military, industrial, and economic systems, as well as the morale of the German people. FDR was very satisfied with the meeting, and he took 6 days before he flew back from British Gambia to the United States. It so happened that on the day that he departed on the Dixie Clipper from British Gambia, heading back the same route, was his birthday, 30 January, just 3 weeks ago yesterday. And he had a birthday party aboard the aircraft. Sitting across from him is Harry Hopkins and his chief advisor, and seated next to him is Admiral Leahy, and the somewhat bemused gentleman to the on the lower right of the screen, that's the lead pilot of the Dixie Clipper. And I don't know about if that's a real drink or not, folks, but it's a good thing they had multiple crews aboard. Now, if at this exact moment, 1900 hours Zulu, 13 February 1943, you had heard a briefing at High Wycombe, you might have heard something like that, because that's exactly the way it was. And for the 8th Air Force, it all started on 28 January 1942 at an armory in Savannah, Georgia, with 7 officers, Colonel Asia Duncan, and nothing. There was no airplanes, no airfield, no mission, no air crews, no officers, no nothing. And yet, 5 months and 6 days later, on 4 July 1942, the first mission was flown by the 8th Air Force against German targets. Happened to be an airfield in Holland. Happened to be with 4 British Lend-Lease A-20 that they called Bostons, we called Havocs, which we had loaned them. We borrowed them back, painted stars on them, and flew over to bomb an airfield in Holland. 2 of the aircraft were shot down by flak over the airfield. 1 was shot down by an FW-190 Focke-Wulf fighter over the English Channel. 1 got back. But thus began the daylight operations of the 8th Air Force. Now, in my comments today, I'm going to be covering several things. We're no longer back in 1943, by the way. We've moved on from that. We're here at the 57th Fighter Group. What about the bombers? The Royal Air Force had several medium bombers, one of which was pretty good, the Wellington. They had 2 main heavy bombers, the Halifax and the Lancaster. They had another heavy bomber early on called the Sterling, which had a very low ceiling, could carry a lot, but it had a very low ceiling, was very easy to shoot down, and it wasn't very successful, and they converted them to transports once they started getting the Halifax and the Lancaster. So I'm going to mention briefly the Mosquito. You may go online, remember we're today, not 1943, you can go online and you'll see some people saying, oh, we should have just gotten a bunch of Mosquitoes because they could carry 4,000 pounds like a B-17, and they were really fast and flew really high, and they could win the war. That's nonsense. The Mosquito was built out of plywood primarily. It saved precious war materials for Britain. And what is more interesting about it, it had a very high ceiling, about 40,000 feet. It had a top speed, later versions, of over 400 miles per hour. So by the time the German fighters could detect it and go after it, it was gone. So that seems to argue well for that. However, once they put 4,000 pounds of bomb in it, it didn't have a 40,000 foot ceiling, nor did it have a 400 mile an hour top speed. It was now vulnerable to fighters. And unlike most of the bombers, when a Mosquito got hit, it was table for one, and you weren't at the table. There are documented cases and Luftwaffe films showing Mosquito pilots bailing out when they know that a German fighter is closing in on them. They haven't even been hit yet because they know their plane is just going to go up instantly. So it had to be done by the heavies. The Halifax was an excellent bomber, and quite honestly, if I had to fly one of the two, the Lancaster or the Halifax, that's what I would have picked for a number of reasons, some of which I'll cover under the liabilities of the Lancaster. But it was a good plane, and it accompanied the Lancaster on most of the raids. The one great advantage, it had a good range, 14,000 pound maximum bomb load, so it carried a lot. The Lancaster, on the other hand, had a slightly higher service ceiling, 24.5, and a similar range, a similar bomb load, typical maximum. However, it was extremely adaptable aircraft, and they could modify it to carry up to 22,000 pounds. And because of its versatility, it became the iconic bomber for our British allies. Now, what about the 8th Air Force? Well, we basically standardized on two aircraft, the B-17 and the B-24. The B-24 turns out to have been more suited to the Pacific theater because it had a somewhat longer range and typically could carry a bit more. However, it was not as robust as the B-17, and consequently, with the heavy density of fighter traffic that we encountered in the European theater, even though there was one air division, over the course of the war, more and more B-17 fighter groups grew, B-24 fighter groups declined, and bomber groups, from B-24s became B-17 bomber groups and went to the 1st or 3rd Air Divisions. The B-17 is really the iconic American bomber of the war. It had a range that could get it into and back from Germany. Its bomb load varied between 4,000 and 8,000 pounds, depending upon the range, and it had a very high ceiling. And this is significant because it typically flew about 10,000 feet higher than the B-24 or than a Lancaster, for that matter. Had a very high service ceiling. And it had gone through an evolutionary process. This is what the B-17s we had at Clark Field in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked, that's what it looked like. These are the ones we sent to the British when we, on Lend-Lease, some B-17s. This is what the final iteration was, and by the way, nearly 70% of them, or 68% of the bombers look like this, the B-17G. It almost doesn't look like us from the same planet, let alone the same aircraft. A Seattle newspaper reporter out at the Boeing factory saw these planes, and he quickly said, "It looks like a flying fortress." Boeing said, "That's a cool name." They went out and trademarked it. That's what we know it as today. All right, so we have two iconic bombers. How do they compare? Well, let's take a look. The Lancaster had some very significant advantages. The Lancaster's bomb bay was 33 feet long, and it was unencumbered with structural braces. So this photograph shows it carrying 14 1,000-pound bombs. That's pretty impressive. Over here, you see a 4,000-pound canister bombs and a whole box load of incendiary cluster bombs. Each one of those packets when dropped from the airplane, would release 128 4-pound incendiary, what I'll call bomblets. And they would set all kinds of fires, which the British did with some great dispatch. This is significant. The aircraft weighed dry a little over 18 tons. It could carry almost 17 tons. That's amazing. It could carry almost its own weight. And as Luftwaffe pilots reported in documentation that I've read again and again, it was surprisingly maneuverable. And it was very adaptable. They used it to bomb the Ruhr Valley dams, the dam busters, etc. Now, what it could carry? It could carry 1,000-pound bombs. It could carry a 4,000-pound heavy capacity canister bomb. But that's not all. It could carry, how about a 12,000-pound tall boy penetration bomb used against hardened targets like U-boat pins. And there was a slightly smaller version, slightly different technology called the Earthquake that weighed 10,000 pounds. It would flatten an entire city block and as well as knock down and shake down buildings for a quarter of a mile beyond. By the way, on this photograph, you notice this bomber, this Lancaster has a little blister down below. That's for the H-2S, S as in Sam, airborne radar, which enabled them to look down at the terrain, identify cities, targets, etc. Enabled them to fly and bomb through the clouds and above the weather. The Americans developed a version of this called the H-2X, which we named the Mickey. It had a more rounded appearance below the B-17, and it operated on a different frequency, which caused the Germans some problems. This is what a tall boy looks like against a Lancaster. Tall boy was about 22 feet long. Lancaster's about 70 feet long. You see how big that bomb is. But wait, there's more. There was, how about the old 22,000-pound Grand Slam? That's a huge bomb. Again, the Lancaster was modified. This is a photograph of one dropping it. They removed the bomb bay doors. The bomb was partially exposed when the aircraft was airborne because there were module bomb bay doors. It was too big to totally fit in the aircraft. But it wasn't all roses. The plane had been built as light as possible, and so there was little or no crew protection. There was no co-pilots, a crew of 7. Poor defensive firepower. They were using .30 caliber machine guns. And no ventral turret. That is, there was a dorsal turret on top, but no turret down below. Very tight quarters, so most of the crew could not put on their parachutes. Very difficult to get out of fast, and this is shocking. When a Lancaster went down, 4 out of 5 of the crew members did not survive the downing. Only 1 out of 5 could get out, and he might have been wounded. To illustrate the point, these 3 blue circles you see here represent emergency exits. None of them are suitable for exit with a parachute. They're primarily for ditching. This is the parachute exit, as long as you don't weigh more than 175 pounds. The primary exits for everybody was back here, and it was a narrow catwalk over the bomb bay to get back to the main entrance and exit door on the side. The tail gunner could flip open his canopy with some difficulty, but he couldn't fit in the tail gunner position with his parachute on. It was tough to get out of. How do they compare? What about the B-17? It had evolved. It was very stable in flight, had a high service ceiling, fairly good crew protection, a lot of defensive firepower, could take a lot of punishment, and the crew could get out. To illustrate the point, these are the emergency exits on a B-17. A lot of ways for the crews to be able to escape the aircraft, and a much higher percentage something like 60% of the air crews survived being downed in a B-17, 60% plus. And we all have seen the pictures online. There are hundreds. I just grabbed a couple out of the ones that I have. These planes got back. It's pretty amazing. Weaknesses. Relatively small bomb load. Early versions were vulnerable, didn't have good firepower going forward. The 50 caliber machine gun, a lot better than the 30, but only was accurate between 600 and 900 yards. So when we were going with daylight raids, the Germans would send their destroyer, their Zerstörer aircraft, twin-engine aircraft with 20-millimeter cannons, and they would just hover out there at 2,000 yards, or pardon me, at 1,000 yards, and fire from there, out of the range. Vulnerable to flak from the initial point. That is the point where the bombardier takes over. The Norden bomb sight flies straight and level, and it's vulnerable to flak. Damaged aircraft were targeted by the Germans, of course. Before air support occurred, there was a crew learning curve also. They were flying against hardened pros, and these are new flyers. A lack of heating. Very significant. When I go through mission reports and things, every time I look at them, what do I see? I see half a dozen, 8, 16 cases of frostbite. Guys having their skin peeled off when a waist gunner with his window open at 50 or 60 below zero has to unjam his 50 caliber machine gun hanging out this window, and he takes his glove off to do it, and his skin just sticks to the machine gun. The Lancaster dropped a lot more, but it had a poor survival rate. It was politically important. And you can't understate this, because Britain needed to know that they were giving back to the Germans what the Germans had done to them. The B-17 did cripple the war production. The documentation I've read on the German side indicates that they definitely felt the effect of the B-17. Something else of significance. In the early daylight raids, both the RAF and the 8th Air Force were losing about 80% of their bombers to fighters. As the war progressed, the RAF continued to lose the vast majority of their bombers to German fighters. The 8th Air Force, initially at about 80%, at the end of the war, we were only losing about 10% of our bombers to the fighters, and most to flak. Overall, the total number for the war, about 44%. Now, what about tactics? Well, in the case of the RAF, daylight raids, they used medium and heavy bombers. No large-scale attacks, they didn't have enough planes. Inaccurate bomb aiming, which is what they call it. Unacceptable targeting results. Uneconomical in terms of losses. Unsustainable losses of planes and men. This is an example of an early daylight raid. They sent out 3 waves, total of 19 aircraft. 8 of them got shot down. Pretty uneconomical. I love that term. I wouldn't have loved it if I was there. But so they went by night. Now, the night tactics were season, moon, and weather dependent. Arthur Harris said, you know what? If it's the summer, Berlin's pretty safe, because we can't get our bombers out and back without them flying in daylight, and they are sitting ducks in daylight. Mosquitoes would pathfind and harass. Navigation to target got better and better, especially with the H-2S radar. The city center became the target, and they were going to flatten everything and therefore eliminate the enemy workforce. Sir Arthur Harris basically said the Germans thought that they could do it to everybody else, but it would never happen to them. Well, as he said, they sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind. Perspective. RAF casualties were 64,000 out of 125,000 aircrew, of which 56,000 were killed. more than half of the air crews were casualties, and 44.5% of them were killed. This meant that if you were in a downed bomber, you had an 88% chance of not surviving in a Lancaster. They had their own nickname, the RAF crews, for Bomber Harris, Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, as the popularized him. They called him Butcher Harris. So what do the Germans think? They liked the RAF to come during the day. Formations came very predictably and revealed their object. That's what the Germans called the target, the object, whether it was a city or whatever, the object. Bombers had excellent radio discipline. The British bombers did, but they were vulnerable to attack, and the Germans also recognized the British had better technology. They respected greatly the RAF bomber crews. What about 8th Air Force tactics? Well, focus on strategic targets. To try to marginalize the war production, bomb during the daylight, optimize on 2 heavy bombers, sending them on missions where it made sense. For example, the Ploesti raid in Romania was by B-24s because of the longer range, etc. Use large formations and their firepower versus fighters. From 1942, how did that work out? To late 43, high losses without escorts. Target limitations because the Spitfires couldn't escort them very far. Early results were not encouraging. An interesting guy named Colonel Curtis LeMay with the 305th Bomb Group saw all this, and he said, you know what, we're doing 2 things wrong. We're flying loose formations and everybody's got a bombardier trying to find the target. Let's get the formations real tight, let's put the best bombardier in the lead bomber, and let's all bomb when he drops. And you know what? The losses went down. And by the way, once we go to the initial point, there's no more faking left and going right. No more of that. You're going straight to the target. Forget the flak. You're going straight to the target. In fact, he, in a memo, said anybody who does not do that will be court-martialed, and he would fly in the lead plane. So he put his money where his mouth was. Greatly improved results, but still high losses. This is a combat radius of a Spitfire in May of 1943, and you can see it's just basically getting into some of the occupied territories. P-47 starts coming online mid-1943, and you see it increases somewhat to about 230 miles. Well then, the combat radius on another version of the P-47 with the first versions of the drop tanks, it extended it out to about 375 miles. You could get into Western Germany. But starting in late 1943, above all else, and no, I didn't have any sound that I put in for this, Jeff. This is my Jeff slide, okay, because he likes to have airplanes flying around. P-38, P-47, P-51, each of them had nicknames. The Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil for the P-38, the Jug for the P-47, and for Juggernaut, by the way, and the Cadillac of the Skies for the P-51. Full mission escorts begin, the tactics change, the bombers get through. Big week began the true marginalization of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. And mission requirements were raised, but more bomber crews were coming back and going home. Combat radius increased with a P-38 with drop tanks out to about over 500 miles. And then, of course, the P-51 came online in December, and the P-47 got advanced drop tanks, and a later version of the P-47, it went out to 600, it hit every major target in Germany, now with escorts. And this is combat radius. That's not the maximum distance. A P-51 could fly with drop tanks 1,500 miles. Combat radius was 600 miles to leave some fuel for bobbing and weaving and carrying on when he got the, when the bad guys came. So what do the Germans think? Well, they liked the 8th Air Force when they flew naked. That naked meaning without fighter escort. Formations, however, came very unpredictably. The Americans would fake left, go right, fake left, and go left, and they could never really figure out exactly where they were going. However, they had very poor radio discipline. They would sometimes take hours to assemble into the bomber formations out over near the English Channel. The tight formations were challenging. They had great respect for the B-17, and they absolutely abhorred the Mustang. They greatly respected the American bomber crews. They were disciplined in a different way than the British were. They were terrible on the radio. And by the way, the fighter pilots were the worst of all. They were very, very chatty. And this was interesting because it had an unnerving effect on the control centers that are controlling the fighters and telling them where to go. Why? Because these guys, we listen, you know, they're on a party line when they're talking on the radio. The Germans are hearing them and they're saying, these guys are coming to win. And they're coming for us. That's what they were hearing with all this conversation. Our pilots were optimistic. They were coming. They definitely respected the bomber pilots, and they absolutely, positively hated guys like Punchy Powell. The achievements, no less than Adolf Galland, head of the Luftwaffe Fighter Command. They proved strategic air warfare, and they proved it by achieving total air supremacy. Meanwhile, back at the Reich, the German Air Force was fighting 24/7. Beginning in 1943, mid-43, the Allies began to coordinate target types. The German Air Force is furiously trying to add night fighters. This requires technology. Manufacturing was having problems getting the technology. The quality of the pilots was declining. They were trying to upgrade their technology, but the losses were mounting, and they know, the documentation that I've read said the Germans realized the war had turned in 1943. The decisive battle was D-Day. That was the decisive battle. But they knew the war was absolutely turning in 1943. The German air defense looked like this. They had the Luftwaffe and they had the Flak. Now, two misconceptions that I'll clear up right now about German Flak. The first is they did not use proximity fuses on their Flak. They used either barometric and more typically timers to fire. The second one is they didn't shoot at the bombers. What they did is they used predictive fire. The bombers are there. They're flying now from this initial point at a straight, narrow predictive. They know the speed, altitude, and direction. Using quick triangulation, they can say, okay, they're there. That means in 41 seconds, they'll be right there. Let's see, at that altitude, an 88 shell would take anything from 12 to 25 seconds to get to the altitude to explode, depending upon the altitude, where the 21 to 32,000 feet. So they calculate all that. Okay, so we need to fire in 15 seconds, and we need to fire in 26 seconds. And a good flak crew, an experienced flak crew, could fire, reload, and fire again about every 12 seconds. Some could even do it in 10 seconds. A brand new crew could do it in typically 20 seconds. The typical crew could fire about every 15 to 17 seconds, was pretty typical. A very powerful weapon, arguably the best piece of artillery in the Second World War. The German air defense, the offense, always had complete priority. And throughout the war, defensive units would be sucked out to support ground units for some real or imagined offense taking place. They were counting on the U-boats to strangle Britain. The front line, however, saw what Britain did when the Luftwaffe was attacking Britain. Britain had an integrated air defense, truly integrated. And the British saw that and they said, good grief, I wish we had that, because they didn't. But the high command, Goering and the Fuhrer, were deaf to these requests, so they set up perimeter defenses. That is, hey, we'll stop them when they're out there. We're going to set up defense out there in the occupied countries, and they'll never get to Germany anyway. Well, they were, of course, wrong. This is a flak map. This is my dad's, by the way. It's dated 10 September 1944. This is a personal item. And you see the flak concentrations. Now, they used flak zones early on. That is, where the flak wasn't, that's where the fighters would operate. They would use the same kind of a map, the fighters would. These white shaded areas are areas where flak concentrations have been overrun and are now the Allies hold those positions. This is 10 September 44. Hence, you can see how far we're nearly in Aachen, which we captured like a month later. In mid-41 to mid-44, the offense still has priority, but the Allies are now making very determined attacks. And there's two things, political and military. From the German standpoint, politically, they needed to stop that night raid. They needed to not have their people getting bombed. Militarily, they realized the 8th Air Force was killing them. The day attacks were slowing war production. Reorg de Tages, the reorg de jour, if you will. It was hindering. The Luftwaffe and the German Air Force were continually going through reorganizations. Every time something started to work, it would get pulled away. And one of the things that it's just amazed me when I learned this, they were getting very skilled control units that were operating radar and other detection devices to figure out where the bombers were coming and to figure out, the best ways to stop them, etc. And all of a sudden, they would get a directive that would come in the middle of the day, and they say, okay, you need to send 30% of all your controllers to the Russian front as infantry. And they would lose qualified people. They would bring in untrained women, literally, which they called feminine controllers. And they understandably weren't they had no experience. And they were draining the resources enormously. Night fighting was getting the technical resources, and Luftwaffe and flak coordination. Some of the flak coordination with Luftwaffe was ludicrous. There was a case of a fighter command which shared the same building with a control command. The group commander of the Luftwaffe would always send one of his officers or a couple of his officers over to the control unit because they knew where the bombers were, etc., etc. You're going to love this. Wait for it. We have our problems, okay? Bureaucratic problems. Wait till you hear this one. You're just going to love it. The group commander of the fighters says, "Holy cow, they're coming to Munich. Let me get my fighters going." And the commander of the control unit ranked him. He came in and said, "No, you aren't," because they had centralized control. And everything that they got in this control unit outside Munich had to go first to Paris. And Paris, meanwhile, is sorting through stuff because other stuff's going on. And these bombers are coming, and they're waiting to hear back from Paris, and sometimes the instructions from Paris didn't come until the next day. Okay? That's a bureaucratic nightmare, folks. Now there are two types of night fighting: light night fighting and dark night fighting. Dark night fighting is they were controlled. Okay, the bombers are here, you're about 5 miles away, etc. You can close. Okay, I have visual, or I have him on my Liechtenstein radar, and I can close in. That's dark night fighting. Light night fighting is, okay, all the flak batteries are standing down, but we've brought in an extra 100 searchlights. We're going to light up the whole sky. Go get them. Bildesau, wild boar tactics. They're going to go after them. Mid-1944 until the end, the perimeters obviously melted away because we're running over those countries. The RAF is making major attacks, and it's still political and military, but it's not going well in either case for the German air defense. D-Day is the decisive battle of the war, and toward the very end of the war, toward beginning in early 45, the German High Command indicated that when you go after a formation, do not shoot at anything that doesn't have 4 engines, because they were running out of fuel. And so you got to have 4 engines to be shot at. And the German fighter command realized the only way to stop the bomber was to regain air supremacy. You had to go after the fighters, but their fighters were optimized to shoot down the bombers. They carried very heavy cannons versus lighter machine guns, etc. Fewer and fewer versus more and more. So challenges during the entire war: bureaucratic nightmares, resource nightmares, continual priority changes, There were many documented cases where the flak Luftwaffe coordination really sucked, and German fighters at night were shot down by flak batteries. The fighters were optimized, as I just mentioned, versus the bombers, and the top leadership could not adapt, from Goering and the Fuhrer. Luftwaffe's tactics. They had two primary fighters, the Bf-109 Messerschmitt and the FW-190 Focke-Wulf. This was divided toward the end of the war into two types, a light fighter and a heavy fighter. The Focke-Wulfs were all heavy fighters. Heavy fighters meaning they carried a lot of cannon, 420s, and later in some cases 430 millimeter cannons. And I can tell you there's some liabilities to the 30 millimeter cannon, but that's another story. You can ask me later. The Bf-109 in the light fighter version, the light what they call light SE, light single engine, would carry a single 20 millimeter cannon and a couple of machine guns with limited ammunition, but it could fly at a higher altitude, and its purpose was to engage the fighters. And the heavy version of that had multiple 20 millimeter cannons, as did, of course, the Focke-Wulf FW-190. These are their starter aircraft, the destroyer aircraft. They would go after the RAF bombers or the 8th Air Force bombers before escorts, and they had 20 millimeter cannons was the standard. This one is shown in a night configuration with a 50 millimeter cannon in a blister below it, because the same aircraft were used at night against the British. Once the escorts began, these guys never showed up against the 8th Air Force. Because they would get shot out of the sky in a big hurry. So they didn't show up anymore, and they were only used at night. And of course, the advanced fighters, too few, too late and too few. The Volksjäger Henkel 162 over there, People's Fighter. The Comet, it was a phenomenal airplane, very fast. Maximum rate of climb was over 31,000 feet per minute. 31,000 feet per minute, folks. Maximum rate of climb. The 262 was 100 miles an hour faster than the P-51s. However, too few, too late. Versus early daylight raids, they were able to detect the British coming from radio direction. Primitive radar helped. The perimeter defense was effective. And the extensive use of the destroyer aircraft, they had flak zones, as you saw, and they would exact a heavy toll, which made them unsustainable. Now, the Luftwaffe versus the RAF, during the day, the destroyer aircraft would attack from beyond defensive range. Against the 8th, the initial tactic was to attack from the rear. That's a German picture of a German training document. They had a nickname for the B-17. They called it Die Stachelschwein, can't talk, which means the porcupine. And they called the box formation ein Stachelschweinwald, a porcupine forest. They respected it. But they figured out that the Germans figured out that it took 20 hits with 20 millimeter cannon to bring down a B-17 coming from the back. Only 2% of their shots were hitting. So it would take 1,000 rounds to bring down a B-17 on average, which might use up the entire complement of ammunition on a fighter or multiple fighters. So they changed their tactic. They would identify the bomber formation. They would fly far enough away that there was no hope of the 50 caliber machine gun defensive fighter power reaching them. They would swing around and attack from the sun, 10 o'clock high, 12 o'clock high, and make very fast slashing passes at the B-17s. The B-17, the Americans, in defense of that, modified the B-17 again, put that chin turret on it, and it helped. And of course, the fact that it had fighter support. The passive technology was they would listen in, detect the British, or the Americans for that matter, and then active technology. They had two types of basic radar, or three types including airborne, the lower. The Freya radar basically could see out initially out to 50 and late in the war out to 120 miles, but it couldn't detect the altitude. It could just say there's a formation out there. Now the Würzburg radar was much better at detecting the altitude, etc. It was less fuzzy. But it had a liability also. It couldn't pick out numbers. And the RAF particularly figured out that the radar cells could be, because they had these individual radars in cells, they could fly between two cells, and the cells could pick up, well, there's a bomber. They didn't know if it was 2 or 200. And the British initially were flying in very loose formation, far separated, individual bombers. So a single night fighter could go up, get tracked to a bomber, a dark night fighter, could get tracked to a bomber, could down it, and then could go attack another bomber, because they were that far apart. Well, the British, what they started doing, and then when the bomber got over the flak area, everybody could shoot at that one bomber. So what the British started doing is bringing them in closer together, number one. Number two, send multiple, 2, 3, maybe even 4 over the target area at the same time. Divided the flak, and the second thing it did was it neutralized the ability of the night fighters to go after multiple bombers, one after the other, because they were spaced apart. It cut down the target time, the amount of exposure over a target from something like 4 to 6 hours for the RAF bombers down to less than 90 minutes. So it made a big difference. The airborne, these are radio advances as well as an airborne radar. But again, the radar cells could be fooled. The Luftwaffe versus the RAF at night, you attack from below on the right. No ventral turret. Some of the night fighters actually began to mount their weaponry that faced up. So they just fly right under the bombers, turn a little bit, and fire. They didn't even have to pull up into the bomber. They literally. And by hitting, and one of the reasons they flew to the right was, number one, convention, so everybody knew that the guy in front of them was on the right side of that bomber. And the second thing is, since they were firing down below, a lot of times they would hit the bomb bay, which they typically did, and if they hit a bomb, it wasn't even table for one. And the Germans had a problem throughout the war with all of their fighters. They didn't have an effective means of clearing their windscreens. They would get dimming, what we would call fogging, and they would get icing. Their ability to control that was poor, and it was particularly poor when a bomber blew up and there was oil all over the place. And by the way, the Lancaster was a hydraulic bomber and liquid-cooled engines, whereas the B-17 was an electric bomber and had air-cooled engines. Epilogue. In spite of all that, there were brave men on the German side that gave their life for their country. What was it that General Patton said that I love so much? He said,
"You're not a hero for dying for."
No, wait. I know this by heart, and I'm pulling up a different part of the talk. All right, I'll quote it. Forgive me, ladies. No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. There, finally. I hadn't said it for a while. Okay. They had a lot of brave men that died too. So did we. However, the Führer Knows Best show, both the show and the season have been canceled. And the 1939 to 1945 world tour has been called off. Because we all know how things worked out. And in large part, it was because of these two aircraft. This concludes my prepared remarks. I would be very happy to fend off any possible questions that you may have. Questions?
Right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, really more of a comment. The section where you were showing the bomb load capabilities of Lancaster was very impressive. And it reminded me of a footnote that I read last year while researching the Pacific War. And that is for the Manhattan Project, the atomic bombs. Of course, the B-29 Superfortress was the delivery platform.
Right.
But we weren't real sure because there were a lot of problems with the
Right. I know where you're going. Yep.
Yeah, it had to be adapted. The British Lancaster was actually being considered.
That is absolutely correct, and they had actually good for you. Had actually earmarked some aircraft for that purpose. The Lancaster, actually, the B-29 had a maximum bomb load of 20,000 pounds, and the Lancaster could be modified to carry 22,000 pounds. So they figured that they could probably do what they needed to do with the Lancaster. You're absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I think there were some political concerns about the British aircraft being involved with it.
Sure. Of course, if Churchill got in his way and we were making Lancasters, we could have painted a star, who knows. Other questions?
Was there you mentioned the night fighter with the 30 millimeter cannon and some other stuff.
Oh, good for you. Okay, 20 millimeter cannon had a fairly high rate of fire and was effective from about 1,000 out to about 15 and sometimes 1,800 yards. Very effective weapon. Heavy, but very effective. And I've got a 20 millimeter cannon shell, to compare it to a 50 caliber if anybody wants to see them with me. The 30 millimeter cannon fired at a much slower rate, at a much lower muzzle velocity, and was only effective, believe it or not, only out to about 700 to 1,000 yards. So the fighter pilots, when they got the, ostensibly you say, well, a 30 millimeter cannon, yeah, that's impressive, but the problem is you're going to get inside the firing envelope of the defensive firepower of the bomber. That's one of the reasons the pilots didn't like it. Plus, it was real heavy. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Other questions?
On the 22,000 pounder, I know they bombed the submarine pens, but was there any other use?
I'm sorry. The 22,000, the Grand Slam, they used the tall boy. The Grand Slam they did use beginning in 1945. I believe the British used it on about 3 or 4 raids. It wasn't a lot. It was so big, and at that point, quite honestly, there weren't a lot of targets that were, dense and rich that they needed to flatten everything. They did use it, in a handful of cases. Okay? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, right. On the Lancaster, you could not go out the bomb bay of the Lancaster. It was sealed.
That's correct. That is correct. There was a catwalk over the bomb bay. There were controls inside there for for example, they could manually release the chain shackles that held the Grand Slam bomb. And they could manually release bombs, but no, there was not a bomb bay exit the way there was on a B-17. Good question.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Have you done any research on those skipper bombs that the British developed for dams?
Not any great research. What is your question? Between us, we may know something.
Well, I'm just curious about how effective they were.
Okay, first of all, the technology on you're talking about the dam busters, right. There was and I forget his name, if I know it, I forgot it, a British scientist who actually came up with the idea of a bomb to take out, they had tried bombing these, their idea was the Ruhr Valley, if they could bomb these dams and breach the dams, it would flood the Ruhr Valley, which was where a great portion of the German industrial heartland was. And they felt they could quickly take Germany out of the war by neutralizing their war production in the Ruhr Valley. Well, they tried a number of times to drop bombs, but you remember the British weren't real accurate with their bombs. And as a consequence, they needed something that they could They could fly, if they could fly straight at a certain altitude, I believe it was about 60 feet off of the surface of the water. And this guy developed the idea that why don't we use it like a skipping stone, and it would look like kind of like a barrel, and it would be spun inside the belly of the Lancaster, and then dropped, and it would skip across the water. And they experimented with different sizes, different weights, all kinds of different things to get the correct distance. And they used a triangulation on the Lancaster bombers to get the perfect altitude. They didn't use an altimeter. They actually used beams of light shining on the water. And when you get those two beams together, that's where you hold the bomber, right there. And they used two more beams of light to focus on the dam ahead to know when to drop the bomb. So they used pretty old-fashioned technology of triangulation to figure out when to drop the bomb. And they would drop these canister, what looked like barrels, and they would skip across the water, and then when they got to the dam, they were delayed, they would slowly sink and explode. And they did breach the dams, but it didn't stop the war. That's about as much as I know.
Thank you.
Okay?
Hey, Ray?
Yes, sir.
A quick question, maybe it's a comment, and it's really for Brent. We still today, at the museum and within the 8th Air Force Historical Society, we still got this issue of the B-24 versus the B-17. And it's transcended now to our second and third generations, where there's a constant pride of ownership or authorship.
Oh, sure.
And we're trying to diffuse that as a museum.
Mm-hmm.
So we get them lined up on one side and said, oh, you're the son of a B-17 pilot.
We're B-17 bigots, sure.
Engine Piper Cub.
Yeah.
Then you got the B-17 guy telling the B-24, and I'm talking, these are sons and daughters.
Yeah, sure.
You know, you just flew your grandfather flew a flying coffin, or the box that the B-17 came in. How do we as a society try to say everyone who flew in anything was a hero?
Oh,
And these planes, I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, because it's a real problem. I see it in Facebook posts.
Uh-huh.
It's like, it's so, like, it's carried out.
It's pervasive. Yes, it is. And
1,000 guys in the second air division.
The thing is, one argument that can certainly be used in the B-24's favor is the general staff certainly thought a lot of the B-24. It was a later design. It had the Davis wing, which was a very advanced wing, very thin, long, enabled the plane to be relatively economical in terms of its range and fuel usage. It was built to a different type of spec than the B-17, which was preceded it by about 5 years. And the B-24 had some clear advantages. I mean, it had a longer range, it could carry a better bomb load. And the prioritization of the design of it was different. I mean, there are things that I can tell you about the B-24, maybe I shouldn't, because it had some liabilities. But it was a very effective bomber. It was all we could really use in CBI, as well as in the Pacific initially. We used B-17s, but we couldn't get to the same targets we could with the B-24. The B-24 was a good airplane, and by the way, they built more of those than they built of the B-7, but by a magnitude of 1.5, by 3 to 2 magnitude, 18,000 versus about 13,000. And that 18,000 number, by the way, includes about 2,400, 2,300 of the Navy version and transport version of the aircraft. But I acknowledge that, and I also plead guilty because I'm a B-17 bigot. And yes, sir.